I have spent 400 solar years breathing the recirculated, copper, scented air of the cruel intent. A splinter, class-raiding vessel that has never once known the indignity of a dry dock. My life is measured not in years, but in the frantic, rhythmic pulse of the torture racks and the agonizing whine of the void, sails catching the solar winds of the webway. We do not inhabit the galaxy. We prey upon it from the bleeding edges of reality, slipping through the veins of the universe to excise the wealth and flesh of the Mun, K, and the lesser kin. The transition from the shifting, neon-veiled shadows of Comarite to the cold, stagnant silence of real space is a physical assault on the senses, a dulling of the soul that only the screams of the harvested can truly remedy. To be a raider is to exist in a state of perpetual, predatory hunger. Balanced on the razor, thin edge between godhood and total annihilation, the transition from the relative safety of the webway into the lethargic, heavy dimensions of real space always begins with the taste of rusted iron and the sensation of 1,000 needles pricking the inner surface of my eyelids. It is a biological rejection, the soul recoiling from the crude materiality of a universe that feels like a stagnant pond compared to the rushing, kaleidoscopic rivers of the labyrinthine dimension. We sat in the staging bay of the cruel intent, 300 of us strapped into acceleration couches that felt more like surgical gurneys, our armor interlocking with the magnetic floor plates, as the ship groaned under the pressure of spatial displacement. The air here is recycled until it is thin and dry, carrying the faint, metallic tang of our own adrenaline and the copper scent of blood from the previous night's sport in the lower pits. I watched the pilot through the translucent membrane of the bridge bulkhead. He was a withered thing, his nervous system woven into the ship's cogitators, his fingers twitching in a phantom dance as he guided us through the shifting shoals of the warp gate to the Mon Key. This journey is a descent into madness, but to us, it is merely the opening of a pantry door. We are the architects of a terror they cannot fathom, because we do not kill for conquest, or for the petty ideologies of a corpse emperor. We kill because the void inside our chests is a screaming mouth that must be fed. The mission was a simple extraction on a frontier world of the Segmentum Tempestus, a place where the atmosphere was thick with the stench of Prometheum refineries and the dull, plodding despair of the imperial tithe slaves. As the docking clamps disengaged and the raider dropped from the belly of the mothership, the silence was replaced by the high-pitched shriek of anti-gravitic engines fighting the gravity well of a planet that didn't want us there. I adjusted the seals on my splinter rifle, feeling the slight vibration of the ammunition crystals settling into the firing chamber. Each shard is a sliver of toxin-coated glass, designed not to end a life instantly, but to shatter within the nervous system, turning the act of breathing into an agonizing ordeal. We do not seek the quick death of the bolter or the clean burn of the last gun. We seek the lingering note, the sustained cry that echoes in the warp and keeps the thirst at bay for another few hours. The city below us was a sprawling cancer of iron and concrete, a hive spire that reached up like a pleading hand toward a sky choked with toxic smog. It was beautiful in its decay, a monument to the slow rot of the human spirit, and as we crested the atmospheric threshold, the first alarms began to wail from the defense towers below. They were slow, heavy, and predictable, their radar sweeps missing our jagged, light, bending hulls until we were already among them. I could see the shadows of my kin dancing across the clouds, dozens of raiders and venoms cutting through the smog like obsidian knives. The sensation of the hunt began to take hold, a cold fire spreading from my spine to my extremities, sharpening my vision until I could see the individual rivets on the Imperial bastions miles below. This is the only time I feel truly alive, when the boredom of the long voyage is replaced by the visceral proximity of the prey. We dived, the wind howling against our armor, a chorus of predators returning to a familiar feeding ground. The descent was a blur of grey stone and sudden, violent flashes of orange as our dark matter cannons began to dismantle the upper defense platforms. I remember the smell of ozone and scorched ozone as a beam of pure annihilation erased a battery of hydroflak guns, turning the men manning them into pillars of ash before they could even register the breach. We landed on the deck of a primary manufactorum, the raiders' landing skids grinding into the ferro concrete with a screech that sounded like a dying beast. The ramp dropped, and we were out, a blur of bladed plates and flowing cloaks. The air was thick with the soot of 1,000 furnaces, tasting of coal and misery, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of Comarag. My first target was a sergeant of the local militia, a man whose life had been spent in the darkness of the refineries, his skin stained with oil, and his eyes wide with a terror that I found delicious. I didn't fire. I wanted to see the recognition in his eyes, the moment he realized that his prayers to a silent throne would go unanswered. I closed the distance in a heartbeat, my movements fluid and unnatural in the heavy gravity, and drove my combat blade into the gap between his shoulder and his neck. The resistance of the flesh, the hot spray of liquid on my gauntlets, the sudden hitch in his breathing, it was a symphony. I felt the thirst recede slightly, a cool wave of relief washing over the jagged edges of my mind. Around me, my brethren were engaged in similar acts of intimate violence. We were not a military force, we were a harvest. We moved through the corridors of the manufactorum like ghosts, our footfalls silent on the blood, slicked metal floor. The workers attempted to flee, their heavy boots clattering on the iron grates. But there is no escape from those who have mastered the art of the hunt over millennia. We herded them toward the central plazas, using splinter fire to disable their legs, ensuring they remained conscious and capable of feeling every sensation. The cries began to rise, a cacophony of voices blending into a single, sustained chord of agony that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the building. I stopped to savor a particularly resonant scream from a woman huddled behind a stack of shipping crates. She was clutching a small, useless charm of the Emperor, her knuckles white with effort. I took the charm from her, crushing the cheap metal in my hand before dragging her toward the collection pens. There is a specific quality to the fear of the religious. It has a spicy, desperate aftertaste that the common atheist lacks. As we filled the transport pods, the sky above began to darken further, not from the sunset, but from the arrival of the heavy haulers that would take our prizes back into the dark. The city was dying, its lights flickering out one by one as we sabotaged the power cores, leaving the population to huddle in the dark, waiting for the sound of silk brushing against stone. It is a slow process, the breaking of a world. You do not simply kill the inhabitants. You hollow them out, leaving a shell of a civilization that will remember the shadows for generations to come. I looked up at the cruel intent hovering like a vulture in the smog, its lights pulsing with a rhythmic, sickening green hue. We were barely halfway through the quota, and already the air felt heavy with the accumulated suffering of the sector. My armor was caked in a fine layer of grey ash and dark blood, a testament to the industry of the raid. I checked the chronometer on my wrist. We had 3 more hours before the local PDF could organize a meaningful counterattack. 3 more hours to fill the hold with the screams that would sustain our cabal through the coming cycle. I felt a surge of predatory joy, a rare and fleeting emotion in the grim existence of our kind. We moved deeper into the hive, down into the sweating, humid depths where the air was thick with the stench of the unwashed, and the sound of machinery that had been running for 10,000 years. The lower levels were a labyrinth of pipes and rusted gangways, a place where the light of the sun never reached, and the only illumination came from the flickering red of emergency lanterns. It was here that the true work began. The upper levels were for the display of power, but the lower levels were for the harvest of the soul. We encountered a group of enforcers attempting to make a stand behind a barricade of overturned carts and heavy machinery. They fired their stubbers with a frantic, rhythmic thudding that echoed through the narrow tunnels, the bullets whining off the walls and sparking against our armor. We didn't bother with cover. We moved with a grace that made their projectiles seem slow, drifting through the fire like smoke. I saw a brother to my left catch a round in his shoulder. He didn't flinch, instead laughing as he sprayed a volley of splinter fire into the barricade. The toxins acted instantly. The enforcers fell, clutching their throats as their nervous systems melted, their bodies twitching in a rhythmic dance of death. I vaulted over the barricade, my boots landing silently on a pile of discarded shell casings. One enforcer was still alive, his eyes rolling back in his head as he tried to reload his weapon with trembling hands. I stepped on his wrist, feeling the bone snap with a satisfying pop, and leaned down so he could see the reflection of his own terror in my visor. I whispered a line of ancient Eldari verse into his ear, a poem about the beauty of a fading star, before finishing him with a precise strike to the base of the skull. The deeper we went, the more the environment seemed to warp under the influence of our presence. The shadows grew longer, more predatory, and the very air seemed to vibrate with a low, frequency hum that set the teeth on edge. This is the effect of the homunculus' presence. Even from the ships above, their influence bleeds into the physical world, thinning the veil and making the darkness tangible. We reached the primary water purification plant, a massive chamber filled with the roar of rushing liquid and the hiss of steam. Hundreds of workers were gathered here, hoping the importance of the facility would protect them. They were wrong. We descended from the ceiling on grav wires, a rain of blades and shadows. The slaughter was systematic, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. We did not use our rifles here. We used our hands and our knives, wanting to feel the heat of the bodies and the vibration of the screams. The water in the vats turned from a murky gray to a deep, frothing crimson as we threw the discarded husks into the machinery. I found myself standing atop a massive turbine, looking down at the carnage below. This is the truth of the Drukhari. We are not merely pirates. We are the mirror that reflects the galaxy's hidden cruelty. Every blow we strike, every life we ruin, is a testament to the fragility of the peace the Imperium tries so desperately to maintain. As the last of the resistance in the chamber was silenced, I felt a familiar coldness creeping back into my mind. The rush of the kill was fading, replaced by the hollow ache of the thirst. It is a cycle that never ends, a ladder of pain that we must climb forever just to stay in the same place. I signaled for the transport beams to begin the extraction of the survivors. We would leave this place a tomb, a silent witness to the fact that there are things in the dark that even the Emperor's light cannot reach. I walked back toward the raider, my footsteps echoing in the now silent hall, the only sound the dripping of blood from my blade and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the ship's engines waiting to carry us back to the eternal city of shadows. The return to the cruel intent was marked by the sickeningly familiar jolt of magnetic clamps and the hiss of pressurized atmosphere reclaiming the boarding deck. I stepped off the transport ramp, my boots leaving sticky, dark imprints on the deck plates that would be scrubbed clean by slave laborers within the hour. The air inside the ship had changed. It was no longer just the scent of recycled oxygen and ozone, but was now heavy with the collective terror of the 3,000 souls we had stuffed into the holding pens below. This is the true cargo of a raider. The precious metals, the refined promethium, and the ancient tech relics we pillaged are mere baubles, secondary to the raw, psychic energy of the suffering we carry. I could hear them through the floorboards, a low, undulating moan that vibrated in the soles of my feet, a sound that the ship's engines seemed to harmonize with as we prepared for the re-entry into the webway. I felt the familiar itch behind my eyes begin to subside, replaced by a temporary, cold clarity that only comes when the thirst has been momentarily sated by the proximity of fresh agony. My Kabbalite brothers and sisters moved through the corridors with a renewed predatory grace. Their movements no longer frantic, but measured and arrogant. We are the masters of this domain, and for a few brief moments, the crushing weight of the soul drain felt lighter. I made my way toward the armory. Passing the viewing ports where the burning world we had just pillaged was shrinking into a tiny, glowing ember against the backdrop of the void. It looked so insignificant from this height, a mere spark in the darkness. Yet the misery we had harvested from its surface would sustain our cabal of the severed sinew for months. I began the ritual of maintaining my wargear, a process that is as much a meditation on cruelty as it is a matter of practical survival. My splinter rifle sat on the bench, its sleek, organic curves catching the dim, violet light of the armory. I disassembled the firing mechanism, cleaning each microscopic shard of the toxin delivery system with a silk cloth soaked in the oils of a predatory sea beast from the oceans of Lithuania. The smell was pungent, a mix of brine and rot that cleared my sinuses. To the Mon-K, weapons are tools of war, but to us, they are instruments of art. Every notch on the stock represented a life taken not just in anger, but in a deliberate pursuit of sensory perfection. I remembered the way the toxins had worked on the refinery foreman, the way his skin had turned a translucent shade of gray as his nerves were set on fire. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering. As I worked, the ship began to vibrate with the distinctive high-frequency hum of the webway drives. The transition is always a moment of extreme vulnerability and extreme power. We were slipping back into the veins of the universe, leaving the clumsy, slow-moving reality of the Imperium behind. I looked at the reflection of my own face in the polished blade of my combat knife. My skin was the color of parchment, my eyes sunken and dark, a testament to the centuries I had spent in the shadows. We are a dying race, yet we have never been more potent. The paradox of our existence is that we must consume the lives of others to prevent our own souls from leaking into the warp, a slow drain that never stops, a hunger that only grows more demanding with every passing century. The cruel intent plunged into the webway, and the stars outside the viewports were replaced by the shifting, kaleidoscopic ribbons of the labyrinthine dimension. It is a place of impossible geometry, where distance is a suggestion and time behaves like a wounded animal. I left the armory and ascended to the upper promenade, a place of indulgence where the Archon and his inner circle gathered to watch the spoils being sorted. The air here was thick with the smoke of hallucinogenic incense, a sweet, cloying scent that masked the underlying smell of death. I saw our Archon, Vrask Malidrak, perched upon a throne made of the fused ribcages of a dozen different alien species. He was ancient, his body kept alive by the dark arts of the homunculi, his movements so slow and deliberate they were almost statuesque. He held a goblet filled with a shimmering, iridescent liquid, distilled fear, extracted from the most sensitive of our captives. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a cold weight in the room, a reminder that in Commorragh, power is the only currency that matters. I stood near the edge of the promenade, looking down into the slave, sorting pits. It was a chaotic scene of systematic degradation. The captives were being stripped, branded, and categorized by the racks, the twisted servants of the homunculi. Some would be sent to the arenas of the White cults to die for the amusement of the masses. Others would be taken to the flesh pits, where they would be reshaped into living furniture or mindless grotesques. The lucky ones would simply be worked to death in the weapon factories. I watched a young human woman being dragged toward the branding iron. She was screaming, a high, piercing sound that cut through the low hum of the ship. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, feeling the last of the thirst's jagged edges smooth out. This is the cycle of the raider. We go out into the dark. We bring back the light of life to feed our city, and we prepare to do it again. There is no end to it, no final victory. Only the perpetual motion of the hunt, as we travel deeper into the webway, toward the sprawling, impossible metropolis of Commorragh. The ship's vox casters began to broadcast the celebratory chants of the Cabal. It was a discordant, terrifying sound, a mix of high-pitched shrieks and low-frequency drones that would drive a human insane. I felt a sense of belonging, a cold, sharp pride in my heritage. We are the true heirs to the galaxy, the ones who refuse to bow to the new gods or the old. We chose this path, this eternal raiding, because it is the only way to remain free in a universe that wants to consume us. I began to prepare for the descent into the Dark City. I donned my ceremonial cloak, a garment woven from the hair of 100 different species, and sharpened my blades one last time. The spires of Commorragh were already visible in the distance, a jagged forest of obsidian reaching out into the swirling mists of the webway. It is a city of 1 trillion souls, all of them predators, all of them hungry. To enter its gates is to enter a world of infinite danger and infinite possibility. I checked the seals on my armor, ensuring every plate was locked tight. In the Dark City, your own kin are often more dangerous than any key warrior. I walked back toward the boarding deck, my heart beating with a rhythmic, anticipation-filled thrum. The raid was over, but the games of Commorragh were just beginning. We were coming home with our tribute, and the City of Shadows was waiting to be fed. The hunger never truly dies, it only sleeps for a while, waiting for the next scream to wake it up. I am a raider, a pirate of the void, and my life is written in the blood of the galaxy. The arrival at the gates of Commorragh is not a homecoming in the sense that the lesser races understand it. There is no warmth here, no comfort, only the crushing realization of one's own insignificance within the maw of the eternal city. As the cruel intent decelerated, the shimmering veils of the webway parted to reveal a cityscape that defies every law of terrestrial architecture. It is a sprawling, jagged tumor of obsidian and cold light, a cluster of satellite realms and stolen suns linked by bridges of solid shadow and gravity, defying spires that pierce the very fabric of the sub-dimension. The air changed instantly, losing the sterile metallic tang of the ship and taking on the heavy, intoxicating musk of the city, a mixture of exotic narcotics, ancient dust, and the underlying, omnipresent scent of 1 billion souls rotting in unison. I stood at the prow, my hands gripping the cold railing, watching the traffic of 1,000 cabals. Raiders, venoms, and hellions swarmed like gnats around the base of the central spires, their paths illuminated by the sickly green and violet glows of the atmospheric stabilizers. We passed through the Eye of the Needle, a massive orbital ring of defensive batteries that could turn a moon to ash in a heartbeat, and began our descent into the Port of Lost Souls. This is the heart of the trade, a place where the wealth of 1,000 worlds is bartered for the only thing that matters in the Dark City, the means to prolong the inevitable. The scale of the port is staggering, a canyon of iron and bone miles deep, lined with docking berths that look like the teeth of a predator. As we slid into our designated slip, the sounds of the city rose to meet us, a discordant, deafening roar of machinery, shouting voices, and the distant, rhythmic drumming of the torture palaces. The unloading of the captives is a spectacle of practiced cruelty that I have witnessed 1,000 times, yet it never fails to sharpen the senses. The ramps hissed open, and the first of the Imperial slaves were herded out into the dim, amber light of the docks. They looked like ghosts, their skin blanched by the transition through the webway, their eyes wide and glassy with a shock so profound it had robbed them of the ability to scream. They were chained neck to neck, a long, shivering line of humanity being led toward the way stations of the homunculi. I watched a rack, its face a mask of stitched flesh and brass filters, move down the line with a calibrated probe, testing the nervous systems of the captives for their resonance. To these masters of flesh, a human is not a person, but a vessel of potential agony, a musical instrument to be tuned and then played until it breaks. The air in the docks was thick with the smell of scorched skin as the branding irons were applied. the sizzling sound drowned out by the mechanical whirring of the sorting cranes. My cabal, the severed sinew, takes pride in the quality of its harvest. We do not bring back the broken or the diseased, we bring back the vibrant, the strong, the ones whose spirits will take the longest to extinguish. As I walked down the gangplank, the ground felt solid but strangely wrong beneath my feet, the artificial gravity of Comora always possessing a subtle, stomach-turning jitter. I moved through the crowds of the port, my hand never far from the hilt of my blade. Here, the peace is maintained only by the shared understanding that any act of violence must be absolute and final. I passed a group of incubi, their black armor polished to a mirror sheen, standing motionless like statues of death outside a high-ranking Archon's villa. They did not look at me, but I felt the weight of their gaze, a cold promise of execution should I step out of line. This is the constant tension of life in the city. You are always the predator, but you are also always the prey. I made my way toward the upper terrace, where the air is thinner and the light of the stolen suns is more intense. Here, the spires of the cabals rise like needles, their surfaces etched with the history of 1,000 betrayals. I had a report to deliver to the Draken, a mid-level officer who managed the logistics of our raiding parties. The architecture here is a nightmare of sharp angles and precarious balconies, with no railings to prevent the clumsy or the weak from falling into the abyss below. I saw a group of wyches practicing their craft in a suspended arena, their movements a blur of liquid grace as they danced around a shackled orcish brute, flaying his green skin in long, rhythmic strips. The crowd watching them was a sea of pale faces and ornate silks, their eyes reflecting a hunger that no amount of entertainment could ever truly satisfy. When I reached the Draken's spire, I was subjected to a series of neural scans and physical searches by the automated defenses, the cold beams of light stripping away my privacy with clinical indifference. The interior of the spire was a labyrinth of mirrors and shadow play, designed to disorient and intimidate visitors. I found the Draken in his private solar, a room filled with the drifting vapors of a dream, gas that made the walls seem to pulse like a living heart. He was a thin, wiry individual, his fingers elongated by surgical enhancement, currently preoccupied with a holographic display of the sector we had just pillaged. He did not look up as I entered, but I knew he was aware of every breath I took. The report was a formality. He wanted to know the specific psychological breakdown of the survivors, the exact moment the local planetary governor had surrendered his dignity. I spoke in the clipped, melodic tones of our tongue, describing the terror of the refineries and the efficiency of the harvest. He listened with a faint, predatory smile, his eyes never leaving the map. To him, the raid was a successful harvest of data and resources, a move on a board he had been playing for centuries. Leaving the spire, I felt the familiar weight of the city's atmosphere pressing down on me. Comora is a place of infinite distractions, yet beneath the surface there is an inescapable sense of stagnation. We have lived this way for millennia, repeating the same cycles of violence and indulgence, trapped in a cage of our own making. I wandered into the low bazaar, a place where the law of the Archons is a distant memory and the only rule is the strength of your steel. Here, the air is thick with the smell of cheap grox meat and the ozone of malfunctioning tech. I saw a group of mandrakes flickering in and out of the shadows, their skin covered in glowing, baleful runes that seemed to drink the light. They are the boogeymen of our own kind, creatures who have traded their souls for a power that even we find unsettling. I bought a vial of distilled essence from a street vendor, a liquid that tasted of cold rain and forgotten memories, and felt a brief, artificial surge of vitality. It is a poor substitute for the real thing, but it keeps the shadows from closing in. As the night cycle of the city began, marked by the dimming of the stolen suns to a deep, bruised purple, the intensity of the city's life reached a fever pitch. The sounds of the arenas grew louder, a wall of noise that vibrated in the very bones of the spires. This is the heartbeat of Commorragh, the sound of a trillion screams fueling the survival of a race that refuses to die. I climbed to the top of a derelict observation tower, looking out over the endless expanse of the city. I could see the webway gates pulsing like distant stars, the arteries through which our lifeblood flows. Somewhere out there, another world was being prepared for the harvest. Another population was blissfully unaware that the shadows were coming for them. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. We are the masters of the dark, the pirates of the soul, and as long as there is fear in the galaxy, Commorragh will endure. I checked my chronometer. My next shift on the cruel intent was approaching. The cycle was starting again. The mobilization for a second strike began before the blood had even dried on the docking struts of the previous excursion. In the Dark City, momentum is the only thing that prevents a cabal from being devoured by its rivals. And Archon Maladrak was not a male who allowed his blades to dull through disuse. I was summoned to the embarkation decks of the Cruel Intent by the rhythmic, soul-jarring tolling of the void bells, a sound that vibrates through the marrow and signals that the webway gates are aligning once more. The air in the staging area was thick with the particulate dust of ground, up psychotropic crystals, a fine mist intended to hone our aggression and sharpen our reflexes to a preternatural edge. I could feel my pulse quickening, a frantic drumming in my ears that matched the thrumming of the ship's grav engines. This time, our target was not a mere refinery world, but a pilgrimage moon in the Ocularis Terebus fringe, a place where the faith of the Mon Ki was so concentrated it supposedly flavored the very air. To us, such devotion is merely a denser form of energy, a more complex vintage of suffering that requires a more delicate touch to harvest properly. I checked my wargear with a mechanical precision born of 4 centuries of slaughter. The splinter rifle felt like an extension of my own arm, its weight familiar and comforting. My armor, a secondary skin of segmented, void-hardened plates, hissed as the internal servos locked into place, sealing me away from the crude atmosphere of the coming battlefield. We did not descend with the clumsy roar of Imperial drop pods. We arrived as a silence that eventually becomes a scream. The moon of St. Yvain's Rest was a jewel of white marble and gold leafied cathedrals, illuminated by the soft, pale light of a nearby gas giant. It was a place of peace, which made its impending violation all the more exquisite. As the raiders dived through the thin, cold atmosphere, I saw the white, robed figures below scattering like frightened insects. They had no defenses, no standing army, only the perceived protection of their dead god. Our splinter fire rained down like a toxic mist, each shard finding its mark in the soft flesh of the chanting monks. I remember the sound of their hymns turning into gurgling sobs as the paralytic toxins took hold. We landed in the center of the Grand Plaza, the shadow of our ship falling across a massive statue of a winged saint. The ramp dropped, and I was the first out, my boots cracking the pristine marble. The air here tasted of mountain snow and expensive incense, a purity that I found nauseating. I leveled my rifle at a young acolyte who was attempting to crawl toward the sanctuary doors. I didn't kill him, but I pinned his hand to the stone with a single, precise shot. He needed to be conscious for what was to come. The systematic clearing of the cathedral was a masterclass in terror. We moved through the arched cloisters with the practiced ease of wolves in a sheepfold. I encountered a group of sisters of the Dialogus, women who had dedicated their lives to the study of sacred texts. They met us with prayers, which we answered with steel. The contrast between their serene, melodic voices and the harsh, metallic rasp of our blades was a sensory delight. I found myself in the main nave, a space of staggering verticality where the light of the gas giant filtered through stained, glass windows depicting scenes of martyrdom. It was ironic, I thought, that they worshipped death so fervently yet were so ill prepared to meet it. We began the ritual of the living tapestry, a traditional Drukhari art form where captives are arranged in patterns that maximize their collective psychic resonance. I worked with 2 of my kin to hoist a high, ranking deacon into the rafters using barbed wire, ensuring that his cries would echo perfectly through the vaulted ceiling. The thirst, which had been a dull ache since we left Comarag, began to recede as the atmosphere of the room thickened with the palpable weight of hopelessness. This is why we are the galaxy's most dangerous pirates. We do not just take your gold or your ships. We take the very meaning of your existence and turn it into a joke. By the second hour of the raid, the Grand Plaza had been transformed into a processing center. The white marble was now a canvas of dark stains, and the air was heavy with the copper tang of blood and the ozone of our transport beams. I was assigned to the perimeter, watching for any signs of organized resistance from the moon's small militia. I sat atop a crenellated wall, looking out over the silent, snow-covered valleys. It was beautiful in a way that Comarag could never be, a quiet, stagnant beauty that begged to be shattered. I saw a line of flickering torches in the distance, the local defenders finally rallying their courage to face the nightmare that had fallen from the stars. I felt a surge of genuine amusement. They were coming with lass, carbines, and pitchforks against warriors who had mastered the art of murder before their great-grandfathers were born. I signaled to the scourges circling above, their winged silhouettes blotting out the stars. They dived like hawks, their heat lances turning the column of torches into a line of pyres before the militia could fire a single shot. The hopelessness of their struggle was the final ingredient we needed for the harvest. As the sun of the system began to rise, casting long, pale shadows across the ruins of the cathedral, the Archon himself descended to inspect the work. Vraisk Maladrak walked through the aisles of the living and the dead with the detached air of a scholar in a library. He stopped occasionally to adjust a chain or to whisper a word of mockery into the ear of a dying priest. His presence was a cold vacuum, a reminder that even among the Drukhari, there are those who have forgotten what it is to feel anything but the hunger. He looked at me, his eyes 2 pits of absolute darkness, and I felt a momentary shiver of genuine fear. It is a dangerous thing to be noticed by one's superiors in the dark city. He nodded once, a rare sign of approval, and signaled for the final extraction to begin. We had taken everything of value: the relics, the high-born captives, and the collective soul of the moon. As I boarded the cruel intent, I looked back at the burning cathedrals one last time. The snow was falling again, covering the carnage in a blanket of white. But the memory of the screams would linger in the warp long after the fires had gone out. We were returning to the webway, our holds bursting with the distilled misery of a world that had dared to believe in hope. The transition back into the shadows was effortless, the ship slipping into the veins of reality like a needle into a vein. The descent into the final, deepest pits of Comarag after a successful harvest is the only time the crushing weight of the soul drain truly lifts, replaced by a temporary, manic euphoria that borders on divinity. As the cruel intent docked for the last time in this cycle, the atmosphere of the ship was no longer one of predatory tension, but of a dark, celebratory hunger. We had returned with the distilled essence of a holy world, and the dark city was ready to drink. I stood on the observation deck as the massive, serrated gates of the Archon's private fortress ground open, a sound like a mountain being torn asunder. The fortress of Maladrak is a monument to the endurance of the Eldari ego, a spire of living obsidian that pulses with the heartbeat of the thousands of souls trapped within its foundations. The air here is so thick with the vapors of suffering that it is visible to the naked eye, a swirling, iridescent fog that clings to the skin like oil. We were no longer merely warriors or pirates, we were the providers of the feast. I watched as the primary holding tanks were opened, and the concentrated psychic residue of the pilgrimage moon was funneled into the spire's atmospheric processes. The effect was immediate. The sky above the district turned a deep, bruised violet, and every Drukhari within 5 miles felt the sudden, cooling rush of stolen life. It is the only moment of peace we ever know, the moment the thirst stops screaming and becomes a satisfied purr. I followed the Draken through the inner sanctums of the spire, delivering the final tallies of the dead and the damned. The corridors here are lined with living trophies, enemies of the Cabal who have been kept in a state of perpetual, agonizing stasis by the homunculi, their bodies twisted into ornamental shapes that serve as both warnings and decorations. One was an Imperial captain who had once dared to chase us into the webway. He was now a candelabra, his nervous system wired to produce a soft, amber glow whenever he felt pain. I touched the cold glass of his containment unit as I passed, feeling a faint, thrumming resonance of his eternal terror. It was a comforting sensation. We reached the central audience chamber, a room of such vast proportions that it possessed its own internal weather system, with clouds of incense drifting beneath a ceiling of captured stars. Archon Maladrak was there, but he was no longer the detached scholar of the battlefield. He was resplendent in armor of polished dragon bone, his presence amplified by the psychic feast currently underway. He looked at us not as subjects, but as the tools that had ensured his continued dominance. In Komarag, a successful raid is the only shield against assassination. As long as the Archon provides, the Cabal remains loyal. The feast lasted for 7 cycles of the city's artificial suns. I spent that time in the pleasure dens of the low spires, surrounding myself with the sensory extremes that define our existence. I moved through a haze of exotic narcotics and the refined screams of the arena, slaves, letting the experiences wash over me until my own identity felt like a flickering shadow. This is the danger of the return. Without the focus of the hunt, the mind begins to eat itself. I saw a brother of my raiding party succumb to the glass plague in a side alley, his body slowly turning into a statue of jagged, transparent crystal as his soul finally gave up its struggle against the void. No one stopped to help him. We simply watched the light catch his facets, a final, beautiful tragedy in a city that has seen a billion such ends. It was a reminder that the reprieve we had earned was temporary. The thirst is a tide that always returns, and the next time it would be even hungrier. I left the dens and climbed to the highest balcony of the spire, looking out over the infinite, jagged expanse of the city. I could see the webway gates pulsing on the horizon, the veins of the galaxy waiting to be opened once more. The realization of our true nature hit me then, with the cold clarity of a blade's edge. We are the most dangerous pirates in the galaxy, not because of our technology or our speed, but because we have no choice. We are a species defined by an inescapable, eternal necessity. The Mun-K fight for their emperor, the Orcs for the joy of the brawl, the Tyranids for the hunger of the hive, but we fight for the right to exist for one more hour. Every raid, every scream, every drop of blood is a payment on a debt that can never be settled. We are the masters of the Dark City, but we are also its most pathetic prisoners, chained to the task of harvesting the universe until there is nothing left to reap. I felt the first, faint itch of the thirst returning to the back of my mind, a subtle reminder that the feast was ending. My armor, which I had cleaned of the moon's white ash, already felt heavy again. I reached for my splinter rifle, checking the crystals with a mechanical rhythm that has become my only prayer. The cruel intent was already being refitted for the next excursion. I could hear the rhythmic thudding of the dock, slaves hammering out the dents in the hull, and the high, pitched whine of the void, sails being tuned. We were going back out into the cold, stagnant reality of the Imperium, back into the veins of the galaxy to find a new world to bleed. I walked toward the embarkation deck, my footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the spire. I am a Drukhari raider, a predator of the void, and I have spent 400 years learning that there is no such thing as enough. The galaxy is a vast, teeming garden of pain, and it is my task to ensure the harvest never fails. As the airlocks hissed shut and the magnetic clamps released, I felt the familiar vibration of the webway drive beginning its ascent. The transition began, the taste of rusted iron returned to my tongue, and the hunt began anew. We are the shadows that the light cannot reach, the nightmare that never ends, and as long as there is a pulse in the universe, we will be there to take it.